Example number 1 asks us to consider the market for medical care broadly speaking. So we start with our two-dimensional graph with the quantity of medical care on the x-axis and the price of a unit of that medical care on the y-axis. And we have a upward sloping supply curve and a downward sloping demand curve. Okay, and the interaction of supply and demand gives us our market equilibrium point. That is, it tells us the market clearing price, or the price at which market supply and market demand are exactly equal to each other. So the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded are both equal to Q star. The trend in the US is towards an increasingly older population, and this question asks what we would expect the impact on the price of medical care to be in response to an aging population. An aging population will first affect the demand for medical care. In particular, it's going to increase the demand for medical care because older people get sick more often and therefore they're going to consume more medical care. Now, at the prevailing market price, the market is no longer going to be in equilibrium, meaning that quantity supplied and quantity demanded will no longer be equal to each other. At this prevailing market price, we'll now have quantity supplied still at Q star, but quantity demanded is going to be much higher. In other words, we're going to have a shortage of medical care. And a shortage generally puts upward pressure on prices. So P star is going to start increasing. And when that happens, the producers or the providers of medical care are going to respond by increasing their supply. So we'll move up along the supply curve. But consumers are going to react to rising prices by reducing their demand for health care. And eventually we'll end up at a price where quantity supplied and quantity demanded are once more equal to each other. So that's going to happen at our new market clearing price. Okay? And that market clearing price will give us our new equilibrium quantity of medical care. That is a new Q star where quantity supplied equals quantity demanded and we no longer have a shortage. The market started here, and with the aging population, it moved to a new equilibrium at a higher price and more medical care being consumed. In the previous example, we saw that an increase in the demand for medical care would lead to a new equilibrium price and quantity of medical care with a higher price of medical care and a higher quantity being produced and consumed as well. Okay, but how would our answer change to that example if the supply curve became more inelastic? For instance, because it's difficult to increase the number of physicians who graduate from medical school each year, and therefore it's difficult for supply of medical care to respond to an increase in the price of that care. Okay, in other words, if we have a steeper supply curve, okay, how will our answer change? Well, we start out at the same original equilibrium at P star Q star. But now when demand shifts out in response to an aging population, the new equilibrium moves not from here to here, but instead from here to here. So our new equilibrium will lead to an even higher price, but the quantity change won't be as dramatic as it was in the original example. Okay, so generally speaking, when the supply or the demand side of the market is fairly inelastic, we tend to see more changes in price, okay, and smaller changes in quantity. whenever demand shifts, or in a different example, we could have supply shifting. Example number 2 says a shortage of MRI technicians raises their wages. How does this affect the price of an MRI? So really here we're dealing with two different markets that are connected. So we're dealing with the market for an MRI technician, and we're dealing with the MRI market itself, for which MRI technicians are an important input. So let's start with the first market, the MRI technician market. The question says initially that a shortage of MRI technicians raises their wages. So if we're currently in a shortage, that means that the price is too low. So the price is down here, we'll call it P1. You can think of P1 as the salary or the wage paid to an MRI technician. And if that salary is too low, then few people are going to want to become MRI technicians, and so the quantity of technicians supplied will be low. At the same time, if the cost of a technician is this low, then more technicians will be in demand. So the quantity demanded for technicians will be high, and we have a discrepancy between supply and demand, resulting in a shortage. Now, whenever we have a shortage in a market, it tends to drive up the market price. Okay? And as the price rises, we see an increase in the quantity supplied and a simultaneous decrease in the quantity demanded. And the price keeps increasing in this manner until the discrepancy between supply and demand has disappeared. That is, until the shortage is no longer. Okay, and at that point, the price stops rising and we are at an equilibrium. So I'll call that P star 2, and our new equilibrium quantity is Q star. The second part of the question asks how this increase in the price of an MRI technician, or the wage of an MRI technician, affects the price of an actual MRI that would be done on a patient. Okay, so how are the two connected? Well, an MRI technician is needed to actually conduct an MRI. So the supply of MRIs is dependent on, amongst other things, such as having actual MRI machines, also having MRI technicians. And recall that a supply curve represents the cost of producing a product, the marginal cost of production. So if the wage paid to MRI technicians increases, then so will the cost of providing an MRI. Okay, so let's see what the overall impact will be on the price of an MRI. We start by labeling our original market equilibrium in the market for MRIs, okay, which always occurs where supply and demand are equal. So the starting equilibrium price of an MRI is P star 1, and the equilibrium number of MRIs provided and bought is Q star 1. Then when the price of an MRI technician, or the wage paid to MRI technicians, increases over in this market, it's going to increase the cost of providing an MRI over in this market. Okay, so again, because the supply curve represents the cost of production, we're going to shift inward or upward our supply curve to represent a higher cost of production. Okay, so there's our new supply curve. At the original market price, though, P star 1, we're now going to be out of equilibrium. So specifically at P star 1, the quantity supplied is going to have fallen. It's going to be down at QS, while at this price, P star 1, the quantity demanded remains where it was originally. We'll just call that QD for quantity demanded. In other words, the supply is smaller than the demand, so we have a shortage of MRIs now. Okay, the impact of a shortage, again, is to put upward pressure on prices. And as that price of an MRI increases, we're going to see an increase in the supply of MRIs and a simultaneous decrease in the demand for MRIs. And the price will keep increasing in this manner until the discrepancy is resolved. Okay, so at P star 2, quantity supplied and quantity demanded will now be equal, and we'll be at our new equilibrium. So the end result of having a initial shortage in the market for MRI technicians leads to an increase in the wage of an MRI technician, which in turn increases the cost of providing MRIs and drives up the cost of an MRI. Example number 3 says medical school becomes cheaper, so more physicians graduate every year. All else equal, how does the price of a doctor consultation change? Okay, so I've already drawn here the upward sloping supply of doctors and the downward sloping demand for doctors. And the interaction of the two gives us an equilibrium price of a doctor consultation and the equilibrium quantity of doctor consultations that actually occur in this market. Okay, now, if there are more physicians graduating every year, that's going to directly affect the supply of doctor consultations, right? More doctors means more supply of consultations. So we're going to see a supply curve that shifts out, and there's our new supply curve. Now, at the existing market price, P1, we're now going to be out of market equilibrium. So at P1, our quantity demanded will still be at the original Q1 star, so I'll call that QD for quantity demanded, but the quantity supplied at P star is now much higher. Okay, so we'll call that QS for quantity supplied. With quantity demanded below quantity supplied, we have excess supply. And in any market where we have excess supply, we will generally see downward pressure on prices. Okay, so the market price is going to start to decrease, and as it does so, we're going to see an increase in the quantity demanded for doctor consultations, and simultaneously we'll see a decrease in the quantity supplied. Okay, and this price drop will continue until the discrepancy between supply and demand is resolved. That is, until the two are equal and we are at a new equilibrium, which we'll call Q star 2. And again, this occurs when the price is at P star 2. In the end, the result of having more physicians graduate every year, thereby increasing the supply of physicians, is to have a cheaper price of a doctor consultation and to have more doctor consultations overall. In the previous example, we saw that an increase in the supply of doctors in the market for doctor consultations would lead to a new equilibrium where there are more consultations done overall, so we have a higher Q star in equilibrium, and the cost of a doctor's consultation would be lower, so P star 2 would be lower than P star 1. Now, how might that answer change if we have a more inelastic demand for doctor consultations? Now, by more inelastic, we mean that the demand curve would be steeper because a change in the price of a doctor consultation would have a smaller impact on the quantity demanded. So let's draw a more inelastic demand curve. Okay, so there's a steeper demand curve. Having a steeper or more inelastic demand curve for doctor consultations is probably more realistic than the original flatter or more elastic demand curve that we started with. And this is because people go to the doctor when they're sick, and so if we think that a small change in the price isn't really going to have an impact on how often people go to the doctors, then this demand curve is the more realistic one, the inelastic demand curve. Okay, now let's see how having a more inelastic demand curve affects the answer to the last example. So the way I've drawn it, our initial equilibrium is going to be where the original equilibrium was. So we're still going to have P star 1 and Q star 1 as our starting point. Okay, so now when the supply of doctors increases from here all the way out to here, okay, it's going to have a similar impact on price, that is, price is going to fall, and a similar impact on quantity, quantity is going to fall, but the degree to which each changes will change. So specifically, our new equilibrium will be here, okay? And so our new Q star will be higher than the original one, but not as high as in the past example. And the price, the new price, will be lower than the original price P1 and lower than the new equilibrium price in the last example as well. Okay, in other words, and this is a general conclusion, when part of the market is inelastic, in this case the demand curve, but it could also be the supply curve, then whenever we see a shift in one of our curves, in this case the supply curve, the inelasticity of the market is going to mean that quantity changes less and price changes more than when the market was more elastic. Okay, so to recap that, when things are inelastic, we see larger price changes, smaller quantity changes. The fourth example says some policymakers are concerned that physicians are inducing demand for medical care by convincing their patients to get more treatment than is needed. Why would policymakers be concerned by this? What is the effect on the price of medical care? Now, the reason we might see physicians inducing demand, that is, getting their patients to accept more treatment than is needed, might have to do with defensive medicine, where doctors are sort of over-testing, over-treating to avoid potential lawsuits. Another important factor would be the third-party payment system that dominates much of healthcare in the United States. So in many cases, health insurance will cover the incremental cost of healthcare once a patient has met their deductible or met a copay payment. And therefore, both the physician and the patient are insulated from the actual cost of ordering another test, of having another treatment. If they're insulated from that pricing, from that cost, they're not going to consider it when deciding whether or not to go forth with the treatment. They'll do it maybe just in case. Okay, so let's use our supply and demand model to assess what the impact of this induced demand is on the price of medical care, broadly speaking. Let's start by drawing our upward sloping supply curve and our downward sloping demand curve. And I'm going to add in a little bit of realism here by drawing a steep demand curve as opposed to a flatter demand curve in order to represent the fairly inelastic nature of the demand for medical care. Okay, and we can start by labeling our equilibrium. So we'll call that Q star 1 and P star 1, as we always do. Now let's consider the impact of this induced demand for medical care. Okay, the induced demand is going to shift out our demand curve. Okay, so at any given price of medical care, we're going to see a higher quantity demanded. Okay, so when the price is P1, we're going to see a higher quantity demanded. Okay, in other words, we've now entered a disequilibrium, meaning that there is a difference between the quantity of healthcare being supplied at P1 and the quantity being demanded at P1. In other words, we now have a shortage because the quantity demanded is higher than the quantity being supplied. Now, whenever we have a shortage in the market, it tends to put upward pressure on prices. So that's what we would expect to see here. And as the price rises, we're going to see an increase in the quantity supplied. So we'll move here up along the supply curve. But the increase in prices will simultaneously reduce the quantity demanded. because consumers don't like paying higher prices. So they decrease the quantity that they buy at those higher prices, right? And this price is going to keep increasing until quantity supplied and quantity demanded are once again equal. So that's going to happen when we get to our new equilibrium, which will be characterized by P2 star. Okay, and that'll occur at a higher quantity of medical care being consumed than we had previously. Right, so the reason that policymakers are concerned with induced demand, that is over treatment, but by physicians, is that it's not necessarily because it increases the number of transactions or the amount of medical care being consumed, but rather they're concerned with this because it's going to make medical care even more expensive than it already is.